My name's Donna Fick, and we're all going to introduce ourselves in a little bit, but I'm one of the co-leaders of the NIDUS Mentoring Task Force in Career Development, and I am thrilled to see, most of all, that all of you made it here, because it's not always easy to get into State College, and I know that many of you came from all over the world, all over the United States, so we're going to have, you'll hear this in a minute, but it's going to be 3 days of all teach, all learn, and I really look forward to that. Before I do that, it is my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the College of Nursing, who so graciously, in her very, very busy first 90 days here, wanted to come welcome all of you. Dean Laurie Badzek came here in July from UNC Wilmington after a national search. She is a nurse, an educator, an attorney who specializes in genomics, healthcare ethics, and law. She has served for over 20 years as the director of the ANA Center for Ethics and Human Rights that deals with all issues having to do with relevant to human rights with nurses, all of these issues that are also relevant, of course, to delirium and to older adults. And as you will see, she is visionary, innovative, high energy, hardworking, and energetic. Welcome.
Wow, thank you for a very nice introduction. I am so happy to welcome you here today. To have these types of collaborative, high-level initiatives happening here at Penn State is what we are really all about. We welcome our partners here in this grant, and in particular, we welcome those of you who through a very competitive process have made it to this room today. This is an experience, as I was talking with Dr. Fick, that I wish had existed for me, something like this to apply for many years back. The fact that you are here means you are ready to launch. You are going to leave here with an experience that a small select number gets that helps you to move into a really important field of science. The collaborative efforts of the people who have both brought the program together, as well as all of the faculty and even the returning participants from prior years that are here, is just such a cumulative wealth of knowledge that it's just amazing to me that we have finally gotten to a point where we really know how to do science and do it well. And you know, as a nurse, you think about all of those times, and Donna was just in the back of the room, we were talking about, you know, the way we greet patients back when I actually practiced, and the way some nurses still do it today does not help us to assess the patient at all. But it's through the science that you're going to do that we're really going to be able to impact people in a really big way. And I think that collectively, what else is so amazing here is this is interdisciplinary. I have always done interdisciplinary work because I'm a lawyer and an ethicist, and you can't work alone. So I've always been involved in interdisciplinary work. For the majority of my career, my team was a communication scientist, a physician, you know, a psychologist. And that's what's in this room today. And it's collectively how we really make a difference, because we don't work in silos, especially not in the healthcare arena. So that is just something that I think is spectacular for all of you, from the most high-level person in this room to those of you who are coming to this room with a really bright future. That you are all together is so important. And so I'm so happy that you're here. But I do want to tell you that while you're here, your schedule looks tremendously heavy. So I hope you will take a few moments while you're here to think about your own mental health and wellness. So when you get those breaks, please get up, stand up. Go to the wall if you've been sitting too long. I really believe that we have to have health and wellness, and that we'll be so much more productive for it. So the other piece that I saw in your agenda, and I've been studying your materials, just sort of awing over all that you're going to do, is that tomorrow evening there is a tour of our campus. So whether you take the formal tour with our ambassadors, who are wonderful, or whether you do it on your own, there are two things on the tour that I want to make sure that you know about if you've not been to Penn State before. One is the creamery. So Penn State has their own wonderful ice cream. And I'm going to just tell you the things that people didn't tell me about the creamery, and that is you shouldn't mix flavors. People really frown upon you if you get more than one flavor. Now, it can be done because my children have done it, so they will give you two, but everyone else will look at you very suspiciously. So you really might think about just ordering a single flavor and enjoying it. So they did just have a flavor last week, which I was able to enjoy for the whiteout game that we had. Unfortunately, we lost by a point, but it was very good. And it sounds strange. It's popcorn with white chocolate. It's called whiteout, but I'll tell you what, it's very, very good. Chocolate is also very good. So just so you know. So what I do is I share with my husband. You get something, I get something. And then we get to try two flavors. So definitely go to the creamery. The other thing is to go to the shrine, the Lion Shrine. Get your picture taken there. Anyone who comes to Penn State has to go and do this. If you're collectively there as a group, get a picture taken. We'll put it up on our web page for everyone to see. But the other thing I want to invite you to do is to take the 20-minute walk if you have time or if you don't fly out immediately, and come over to our school, to our college. It was a school, but now it's a college for the last 5 years. Come over to our college. We are getting a spruce up. It's starting to look really great. We actually have some bikes there if you want to come over and pedal a little bit. In the evening, we'll be happy to have you come in to our college and see where we're located. Just behind our college is a place called The Hub, where all the students hang out. There's a huge bookstore there, so if you want to take that shirt home with you, or you've got someone who said, oh, you're going to Penn State, I need a sweatshirt. That's what my children always told me everywhere I went. You can go there. It's open into the evening, I think till 8 or 9 o'clock, so you should be able to get in there. And then right next door, which will be part of your tour, but if you don't go on the tour, is the beautiful original Penn State Old Main. You really should take a moment to step inside of there. There's some beautiful paintings, the history of this university from Abraham Lincoln as being a land-grant institution, et cetera, is in that building, and it's quite impressive. And I will tell you that ESPN College Game Day was on the lawn last week, right out in front of there, so if you happen to see any TV, there were some beautiful pictures of Old Main in the background, and I was actually taking them off of my TV so I'd have pictures of Old Main in the background. So Penn State is a wonderful place for you to be, both for the learning that you will achieve as well as for what is here, just in terms of, you know, sort of a wonderful American institution of higher education and learning, and I hope that you will take it all in while you're here. Again, welcome, thank you. We're honored to have all of you here.
Wow, you know more about Penn State already than I do. Thank you, Dean Badzek. So I'm just, before we kick off our keynote, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes letting everyone get to know each other and introduce each other, talk a little bit about the agenda for boot camp. A little bit about the history of boot camp is the boot camp began in 2013 through a K-07 grant from the NIH to fund the Center of Excellence for Delirium and Aging Research, Training, and Educational, which is short for Cedar Tree. So you might know that this used to be called the Cedar Tree Delirium Boot Camp, and this had the goal of advancing research and training in delirium. In 2017, we had the very first NIDUS boot camp, and as you probably know, the NIDUS stands for Network of Investigation of Delirium Unifying Scientists. We actually changed our name because we realized that we had a very much international open arms in terms of scientists that are, and you'll hear more about this later, but our pilot grants are open to international scientists. Boot camp is open to international scientists, so we changed the name to reflect the unification of the world's scientists really in delirium. And the boot camp is open to researchers from any discipline. We have disciplines from nursing, from medicine, from psychology. We have health economists. We have pediatric delirium scientists. We have people that do quality improvement, ICU delirium, and I'm probably missing some of them. We actually have some that do basic science, so really run pragmatic trials. We run the whole gamut of sort of interdisciplinary, in a broad sense, interdisciplinary work. And I believe that this camp is unlike any other experience that you will gain at delirium conferences. How many of you have attended a delirium conference? Okay, great. In one of our networking days, we'll actually talk about the delirium societies. So when I started doing delirium work back in the 1980s, there were no delirium societies, right, Ed? None, right? In the 80s? None. And now we have American Delirium Society, Scotland, European, we have the eye delirium, and I know I'm missing some, but we have a whole gamut of delirium societies in the US and Europe. So I believe this is different than those experiences. And the big difference is that we really do an in-depth dive into helping you become better scientists. All of you submitted a grant, which I know was a lot of work, and that this was the first year that we made you actually submit the grant with your application, so you should be commended for that. So all of you submitted a grant. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. And all of you will receive at least 3 written reviews for that grant. So you should leave here really being able to really improve your grant. And then all of you will also receive an oral mock review, and the first one of those will be today. In addition, we have in-depth training on the use of the CAM. A lot of our training you'll find, Dean Badzek made a good point, we don't want to sit all day, so a lot of our training you'll see that will be interactive. We also, I will say, we have Jennifer Hoffman coming at one of our breaks, and we call it the Energizer Minute break, but she will make sure that you're not sitting in your chairs, maybe even in an embarrassing way, but we'll make sure that we keep moving. And then we have other talks on ICU delirium, pathophysiology, methods, statistics. We will have one-on-one time. We really listen to your feedback. And one of the things that Eva will send you every day after the boot camp is an evaluation. And we'll actually listen to that feedback in real time. But some of the feedback we got last year is that you wanted more networking time with your peers and with the faculty. So today you'll actually have networking tables that you signed up for. And for those networking tables, I asked you to at least initially stay with the tables that you signed up for. And then towards the end, if you want to peek in and spy on the other tables, that's fine. But so that'll be really one-on-one time where it'll be very informal. And those are things that you asked for. And I'm also going to take just a minute, even though I'm going to have you introduce each other, to tell you how diverse some of your titles and research that you brought to this boot camp is. And you will find in your packet that, and this will help you in the mock reviews, that you have a slide like this in your packet that has the name of the proposal titles and the abstract. And that abstract is to help you follow along with the mock reviews. So I'm just going to read some of these, but we have the ABCDEAF bundle combined with ICU diaries, patients' relatives, and professionals' experience. And we'll have Dr. Wes Eli, who just walked in the room, except I have my other glasses on, is an expert in this area. We have, again, I said pediatrics, so it's not just older adults. We have a proposal that we'll discuss about delirium in pediatric intensive care units, validation of the SOSPD tool translated into Portuguese and its application in diagnosis and prevention. We have developing delirium competencies for a transient volunteer workforce. And I think this is very fascinating given that we just had a hurricane. But it's a pilot study measuring disaster shelter nurse volunteers' ability to recognize delirium. So again, very, very diverse proposals. We'll have a clinical prediction model to detect delirium in the emergency department. And I know, because I see some of you on Twitter, that you're on Twitter, and just this morning a paper came out about the paucity tools that we have to measure delirium in the emergency department, so that'll be great. We have antibiotics and postoperative delirium. We have pathophysiology of delirium and the role of cerebral blood flow and autoregulation, and that's one where I'll learn something, I'm sure. We have another very hot area, delirium identification from electronic health records. A related one, thinking about the use of artificial intelligence to identify delirium. And just a real quick ad, if any of you are in Washington, D.C. on October 24th, I'm part of a National Academy of Science team, and we're putting on a free, open to the public, all-day workshop on artificial intelligence in older adults and persons with disabilities. So check that out. And then we also have Zoe Tiggs here, and Zoe, you can, when we introduce ourselves, tell us maybe the name of your proposal title, because you were awarded, I believe, a pilot grant and are here for that. So I'm sorry I didn't have your title, but we'd love to hear it when you have you introduced. And then I wanted to take a minute to say that we're really missing Sharon Inouye. Many of you know Sharon. Sharon is the PI of the NIDUS grant. Sharon is the reason we have Delirium Boot Camp, because she got the initial grant for the Cedar Tree grant to have Delirium Boot Camp. And Sharon has been my mentor since the 1980s. Much of what I've learned about delirium and about being a scientist is from Sharon and other mentors. And Sharon could not be here today because she had urgent surgery. So at the last minute, I guess about a week ago, we found out that she wasn't able to be here. She is here in spirit. She sent her greetings, and I'm pretty sure she's doing okay, because I saw... Thank you, Eva. Eva actually made those dancing for me because I took a screenshot. But Sharon, after surgery, was tweeting about how excited she is about kicking off Delirium Boot Camp. And I forget what these little guys are called, but I've seen the movie like 10 times with my children. Minions, thank you. So hopefully when Jen comes for our Energizer Minute, we'll be these dancing minions. So, and I do have a card out at the registration desk for everybody to sign for Sharon, so please take a moment to do that. And now, Wes, I'm going to embarrass you, but I also want to acknowledge my co-leader, Wes Eli, and this is a picture that I asked him for. I believe maybe he'll tell you more about it, but he was in a mud run, and I want to acknowledge Wes, and he's actually going to give the keynote in a minute. Wes is an international expert on ICU delirium, on delirium screening, on delirium prevention, on delirium management. If you haven't checked out his website, do, because he has some very moving pictures of persons with delirium talking about their experience. And I put these pictures up to say that as a co-leader, Wes is not afraid to work hard, not afraid to get dirty, and when we needed someone to jump in and do the keynote, he did that, so I thank him for that. I also want to acknowledge, as Dean Badzek did, that we really feel privileged that so many of you said boot camp was so much fun that we're coming back, and you came back not only to listen in on the next 2.5 days, but also to be a mentor for those that you've come before. And I'm hoping that some of the 8 of you here this time, the 9 of you, will say that you're coming back next year to do the same. This is our agenda. Please look at it carefully so you see the breaks. I hope that you join the Lion Tour. We do have a little bit of a late night tonight with dinner. And before I bring in Wes to start right on time at the top of the hour for the keynote, I want to say that one of our big activities today and tomorrow is the mock review. And I want to point out that this is an all teach, all learn. We will run the NIH mock review just like a real NIH mock review. But remember, it's a pretty realistic simulation, except when you're actually getting your NIH grant reviewed, you're not actually in the room. So I want to say that as someone that does that, because in our College of Nursing, nothing goes out the door without a mock review. For me as a scientist, that's been like one of the best things. And even as a senior scientist, sometimes it's hard to sit in a room and have people say, why did you do that? Or, this is a weakness and you need to address this, you need to bring someone in, and even as a senior person. But what I've learned, and I've really learned a lot of this from Sharon, so I wish she was here, is that the iceberg recognizes our successes, but not all these things below, and you guys have seen this before. But what I want to say is those that are willing to give you constructive, sometimes difficult criticism are the ones that really care about you. One of the lines from Sharon that most of the people that know her have heard is red is love. And that means like red marking up your paper, right? So know through your career that we learn a lot more from people who are willing to give us feedback than we do from those who are willing to say, boy, you did a great job, Donna. So again, this is going to be all teach, all learn. I'm super excited about spending the next 2.5 days with you and super honored to do that. And without further ado, I'll bring on our keynote.
Well, as Donna said, my name is Wes Ely. It's a good day for me because I was able to make it here on time. And I just got off the airplane about 10 minutes ago, literally. Of course, there was a delay and that sort of thing. The pictures are from a Tough Mudder. I have Tough Mudders, Tough Mudders, and Toughest Mudders. It's really not that hard. It's just a lot of fun getting that dirty. And it's not a marathon length or anything. It's about a half on length, but they were really fun. I did it a couple of weeks ago, and the reason I sent those pictures to Donna was because she was going out on a long run with her sister that day, I think. So we were both out there getting it done, and it looks like there's some good trails here, Donna. Yeah, it looks great. Ed, it's good to see you. How are you? So what I did at the last minute here, since Sharon is recovering from surgery, is created a PowerPoint of the ICU delirium story. We haven't done this in the boot camp in the past, to my knowledge, this particular topic. And it's been about 20 years that we've been researching delirium in medicine's most critically ill patients. If you think about nursing home, hospital, and ICU, in the United States anyway, the demographics, the epidemiology is that if you graph out the number of beds in the US, the number of beds has been stable for many years, but the percentage of them that are critical care beds has gone up dramatically. So that hospitals are like large ICUs now. And for example, at Vanderbilt, we have about 650 beds, and over 200 of them are ICU beds. So in some hospitals, over 1/3 of the beds are ICU beds. And because of that, the sickest people in the medical system go to the ICU. We need to be good at measuring delirium in those patients. And rather than give you data, mostly what I'm gonna do is tell you the history of how this occurred. And I'm gonna do it by showing pictures and talking about people. And my main take-home points, I'll tell you in advance, are that it's important to know the history of what you're getting involved in from a research perspective, and then to be asking yourself the question, what role do you play in that history? What will be your place in the history of delirium research? Whether or not you're an ICU delirium researcher or not, I think that there will be things that will come out in the story as I tell it that hopefully will resonate with you. And then I'm happy to take questions at any point during this talk. This is very informal, it's a small group, and so please feel free to interrupt me. I think rather than using the roving mic, I'll just stay here at the podium. I love this quote by Abraham Heschel: "Medicine is more than a profession. It is not an occupation for those to whom career is more precious than humanity, or for those who value comfort and serenity above service to others." Now, the hidden reason that I put this quote in this talk is that in the ICU, especially, we oftentimes are pretty selfish about the way that we handle patients based on our own needs rather than on the patient's needs. And what I mean by that is that we like the patients quiet and immobilized so that it's easy on us. And what that does is it creates a hell of a lot of delirium. And the patients who are immobilized, who are receiving tons of exposure to sedative and analgesic drugs because of convenience to the provider, the healthcare provider, not necessarily what is best for the patient. And I think that Abraham Heschel's quote so many years ago speaks directly to the need for us uprooting our selfishness. Part of the story, the way I'm going to tell you, is that I began this research in 1998 with myself and one other person, a nurse, whose name is Brenda Truman Punn. Brenda Punn lives at Duke now in Durham, North Carolina. But we've grown into a group of well over 70 people now, called the CIBS Center, Critical Illness, Brain Dysfunction, and Survivorship. And our CIBS Center, that's our new logo, by the way. You notice how there are dashed lines in the frontal lobes, because the patients are getting problems in their frontal lobes with executive function. I couldn't figure out how to put the hippocampus on the figure, so we're going to leave the hippocampus off there. But this is our brand new logo. It's a new center at Vanderbilt and the VA called the CIBS Center, and this is our first group picture we just had taken about a month ago. But the point is that we went from 2 people into this large research group, and how does that happen? And when it does happen, notice that we expanded from not just brain dysfunction, but to much more broad areas of critical illness, and the intersection between the brain and other areas of critical illness, and then survivorship, because survivorship involves how you do after the critical illness, and it also incorporates family and family and friends. So that's why we chose that name. On our website, you can find much of what I'll talk about here, but I'm going to tell you mainly history, and I'm just showing you that there's a URL, icudelirium.org, where you can go and read more if you just Google ICU Delirium. So let's start at the top of history. This is Dr. Pontoppidan. Who from Boston knows or remembers Dr. Pontoppidan? Anybody? Did you ever meet him? Yeah. Dr. Pontoppidan wrote a series of 3 articles in the New England Journal of Medicine, part 1, part 2, part 3, on ARDS in the 80s. So Ed, you were in diapers. Okay, that's why you don't know Dr. Pontoppidan. Right. But there's a Pontoppidan lecture at Harvard. I was lucky enough to give the Pontoppidan lecture years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, and I met him. He has very severe Parkinson's disease now. But in this article that he wrote for the New England Journal of Medicine, Pontoppidan talks about the problem of ARDS and doesn't bring in the problem with the rest of the body. And what I learned from his article, going backwards, once I started delirium research, was how narrowly focused our mind had been on certain different disease processes in critical care to the exclusion of others. And I'll make that point a little bit better as we go along. C.S. Lewis writes in his book, Surprised by Joy, we lost her as she was gradually withdrawn from our life into the hands of nurses and delirium and morphia. And many of the patients in the critical care setting are dying and withdrawing from life. And the morphia piece is why I chose this quote, because oftentimes the medications that we give advance the delirium and take the patient out of the running for good communication with their loved ones, and it's such a tragedy when that occurs. Almost a half of a century ago, we began using antipsychotics for delirium. This is the first ever report of the use of antipsychotics for delirium in a critical care unit. I worked my butt off to find this report. This is by Ned Kassem. Ned Kassem was a stogie-smoking psychiatrist, Jesuit priest at Harvard years ago who was the chairman of psychiatry for many years. And he first started using antipsychotics, Haldol specifically, in the cardiac intensive care unit. And this was his first abstract of that report in 1978. I had to go to London to find this abstract. At the Royal College of Physicians and working with a medical librarian, going through paper versions of things to find this original abstract. What you can find easily are Kassem's on the left and Stern's on the right reports from the mid-80s on the use of antipsychotics for delirium. But what was difficult to find was to go back to find Kassem's original report in '78. So, and I was determined to do that because it makes it 40 years that we've been doing this with patients. And I'll let you know that on October 22nd of this year, in just a few weeks, we're going to have a report out of the first ever phase 3 placebo-controlled trial of antipsychotics for delirium in critically ill patients. And so that report is we're already working on the galleys of it, but 40 years after Kassem began this project, which has now become ubiquitous and global in terms of use of antipsychotics, we now will have an answer, I hope, about what these drugs do. It won't be the end of the answer, but it's a large advance in our understanding. Now, by the way, Stern, in the last, you probably do know Stern. He's current at MGH, yeah. Did you know that he's in this painting? Stern is in this painting. That was Stern here on the right. He's still a psychiatrist at MGH, and he is the first guy holding the, that's him. They put a beard on him, but that's his picture. That's actually him standing for the pose of the redo of this painting that was done reenacting the first ever use of ether in the ether dome, which I love. You know, I told you this is all about medical history. I put this all together to provide you medical history, and this is part of it. Now, why did I get interested in aging research? Well, my mentor was Bill Hazard, and this is Bill Hazard, one of the fathers of geriatrics, and I shared a wall with him when I was a resident and chief resident at Wake Forest at Bowman Gray. And I went to him and said, I want to do research. I want a research idea, and nobody would give me the idea. So finally, I came up with an idea that I'll tell you about in a moment. But Hazard's point to me always was, Wes, whatever you're going to study, put a wide-angle lens on your camera and include the problems that the aging patients are going to experience as that train comes down the track. And Bill was always telling me to think not only how do problems affect humans, but how do they disproportionately affect older patients. And that was what that's what Bill brought to the table. The reason I was saying Ed is that Ed Aponic was the other mentor early on for me. And this is a picture that Ed gave me of us doing bronchoscopy. I'm a pulmonologist by trade, so I dive down into the lungs quite often. And this is us doing bronchoscopy when I was a fellow. You can see I don't have gray hair at this time. This was in the early 90s, mid-90s. And Ed was the other physician who helped me so much to begin this delirium research. And the way it started was with this New England Journal paper. In 1995, I was on a Stairmaster and I was reading the New England Journal, and an article came out about how to wean patients better off of the ventilator. And I noticed a sentence in that paper, which was the first sentence of the results section. And it said 75 to 80% of the patients screened for this study weren't eligible for the investigation because they were already ready to come off the vent. And I read that sentence and I said, wait a minute, what? 75% weren't eligible because they could already come off the blower, then why weren't they off the blower the day before or the day before that? And that's what gave me the idea to set up a protocol to get them off the ventilator sooner. And everybody but Ed Aponic and Bill Hazard said it was a stupid idea and it wouldn't do anything to change medicine, but we got it in the New England Journal 1 year later, blood, sweat, and tears, no grant, no money, blood, sweat, and tears to do this research. That's a message to some of you who aren't in an area like FEDA in Latin America who don't necessarily have large dollars for grant money, is that we did this with no money, but with drive and passion. We were making assumptions about the elderly at this time, and the way that paper, by the way, led to delirium research was that, I don't think I have this in here, but a year later, a couple of years later, after that New England Journal paper, my wife needed to transfer her job to Vanderbilt in Nashville. So I became a tag-along spouse for my wife going to Nashville. And when that happened, I had to uproot my research and ask, what's the next question? And it turned out that there were a couple of mentors that I will show you in a moment who helped me frame a question that was using the data from that New England paper, and that led us to delirium. So I'll get to that in a moment. These assumptions we were making about elderly patients were that they automatically would do worse in life support, automatically would do worse in the ICU, etc. It's not true. I'll give you the specifics in a moment. But one of the people that helped me understand that was my grandmother. This is Grandma Ely, and she was an amazing person. She grew up in Kansas. She was a mechanic for 18-wheel trucks, the huge, massive trucks that go across the country. And the first time my grandfather ever met Alice, she was elbows deep into a truck, and he came up and asked her a question. She came out like this with grease all over her hands. She was fixing the transmission on a truck, on an 18-wheeler, and he said he fell in love instantly, and they got married. And but Alice surprised me time and time again with her ability to thrive in the face of illness and come back. And as I was watching Grandma do that, I started realizing that we could take old people into the ICU and we could do a good job for them if we paid attention to certain things. What we needed was a safe crossing zone for aging patients. We needed an elderly crossing zone that would allow people to come into critical illness, be cared for appropriately, and then leave that area without being further injured. I took this picture last week, by the way, on my anniversary trip. My wife and I just celebrated our 30th anniversary, and we were riding bikes, and I rode right past this thing, and I didn't see it at all. And she said, "Did you see that sign?" I said, "Yes." She goes, "You need it for your talks." So I turned the bike around and went backwards. I was like, "You're right. That would be good for a talk." So this is the first time I've ever used this slide. But the way that this came about was that we did this New England paper at Wake Forest. I came to Vanderbilt, and I met this man whose name is Gordon Bernard. And by the way, if it's not obvious now, the point of research, the story of research is all about the humans we interact with. It's about our mentors. Donna already said Sharon's been her mentor. So I'm trying to show you all the human beings that made what we now know possible. And after Hazard and Haponic came Gordon Bernard, who's one of the icons of critical care. Y'all don't know him probably, but he's probably one of the top 3 most famous people in critical care in the world. He was the first person to ever do a randomized controlled trial for steroids and sepsis. He was the first person to ever do a randomized controlled trial for a drug that got FDA approved for sepsis. He wrote the initial European Consensus Conference definition of ARDS, so massive human being in critical care. And alongside him was this guy named Bob Dittus. The two of them took me under their wing when I got to Vanderbilt, and I sought out NIH funding, went and got a Beeson Award and a K-23, and with that in hand, started asking the question, what are we going to do about old people in the ICU? And we went back to the original New England paper that I showed you, and there were 300 people there. And I thought, well, they're going to obviously do worse on the vent. Let's just explore how. It turned out, in analyzing those patients, that they did just as fine coming off the ventilator as did the young patients. The weaning, getting off the blower, and all that they were actually a little faster in getting off the ventilator than the young patients. But they had a higher likelihood of bouncing back to the ICU and ultimately dying later on. So if the reason they got in the ICU was the lung for the ventilator, and they got off quickly because of that, but then they had problems later, what was it? And that's what I call a dig the brake moment in research. What you do is, when you see something you didn't expect to see, you don't get upset that you didn't expect to see it. You're glad that you saw something you didn't expect to see. And that's digging the brake. And so what we did was we dove down into that question of what could it be then that was causing them a problem. I'll let you know how I got that phrase, dig the brake. If you actually look at EKGs, QRS complexes, and you look at arrhythmias, the famous book on EKGs by Marriott says that the best place to understand a human being's cardiac arrhythmia is the beginning or the end of the arrhythmia. You look at the break in the rhythm at the beginning or the end. That's what you do for the EKG, is digging the brake. So I applied that term to research. And digging the brake in this situation was, the old people are getting off the ventilator, but they're still having a problem. What could it be? It has to be non-pulmonary. So then I started thinking, is it kidneys? Is it liver? Is it brain? And I decided to focus on delirium. And that's what we did in 1997 with Gordon Bernard and Bob Dittus. And the first person I worked with was this nurse. And she came to my door, she knocked on the door one afternoon. I had nobody working with me. I was by myself doing this work. In fact, at the time, I was the medical director of the Vanderbilt lung transplant program. And I wanted out of that job, but I didn't have enough money and grants to do something different, so I was still the medical director of lung transplant and doing immunosuppression. But Brenda knocked and said, "I'd like to work with you. I heard you're starting up a program in delirium," and she was interested. So she's been we've been colleagues now for 20 years. She's married, has a couple of kids. This is her with her daughter. And she lives in Durham, but she's still very much a part of the SIBS Center. I love Ann Patchett. I don't know, has anybody ever read an Ann Patchett book? Which one? Do you remember? Was it? Yeah, Bel Canto. Bel Canto is her masterwork. They're all amazing. Patron State of Liars, all of these books. But this is State of Wonder. And in State of Wonder it says, never be so focused on what you're looking for that you overlook what you actually find. dig the break. Same point, right? So in digging the break here, I began to go backwards, and I read the original England Romano, 1959. And notice a couple of things that England Romano say. The deficiencies in the education of many physicians ill-equip them to recognize any but the most flagrant examples of delirium. They seem to have little interest in, and indeed often completely overlook delirium. The physician who is greatly concerned to protect the functional integrity of the heart, this is me in the ICU, liver and kidneys of the patient, has not yet learned to have similar regard for the functional integrity of the brain. This is a serious and perhaps tragic omission. Incredible quotes by England Romano. 1959. So I started calling around the country, and I called Sharon, and she completely ignored me. She would not get on the phone. What? I don't do ICU research. What do you want? Why? I've joked with her about this many times. Until I finally just bugged her until she said, okay, what is it? And I said, I think that we should investigate delirium in the ICU. Why? It's going to be the highest percentage of delirium. It's going to be the worst delirium you've ever seen. And convinced her, and she's like, okay, I'm listening. Let's go talk. And so we together developed the CAM ICU. It was a great relationship. I am forever indebted to the teaching that Sharon did to me, for me, and what she did for my career. Alongside Sharon was a guy named Joe Francis. In fact, on the phone, the very first day that I talked to Sharon, one of the things she said was, you're at Vanderbilt, right? And I said, yeah. And she goes, why haven't you just called Joe Francis? Like, go bother somebody else. And I said, well, that's fine and everything, but Joe Francis, at the time, I thought he was in Pittsburgh, because he used to be in Pittsburgh. And he had moved to Vanderbilt, and I didn't know it. Turned out a week earlier, I had been in a geriatric chair search committee meeting, and Joe, well, I didn't know who he was, but some guy walked in and had this funky hat on, one of those kind you pull down over your head like this. And I thought, that's so funny. He's got that hat on, it's inside. It's a cool hat, but whatever. And I didn't know who he was. Didn't get introduced to him that day. We had 20 people in the room. And Sharon said, you've got to go find Joe Francis. He's right there at Vanderbilt. So I looked him up, made an appointment, went in there, walked in the room, and there he was sitting in his office with that same hat on again. Wow, that's the guy. So Joe, I don't know what that is.
That's the presidential alert.
Yes, okay. So Joe and Sharon are who made all of the ICU delirium research happen. Not me. Sharon taught me, and Joe taught me about delirium. I walked around daily in the ICUs. Both these people were incredibly patient, and it was through that, and then through my friend Ed Marcantonio, that we began to advance this field of ICU delirium research. Ed, as you know, I put this picture up of him in his 3D CAM paper, and Ed, you did a great job on this paper, extremely good job. I've been bragging on this paper to many people over the years since you published it. But I would really say that the three people who actually forged the way for ICU delirium research were Sharon, Ed, and Joe. Without those three people, I never could have done any of this stuff because I knew nothing about delirium. And they took time, and they were patient, and they helped mentor me in this area. Well, at the same time, we didn't have a language for measuring what I knew was a huge piece of the delirium story, which was sedation use. We were using something called the Ramsey scale, done by Michael Ramsey, who's a friend of mine. It was never intended for this purpose. It was published years ago. It wasn't ever validated for use in ICU patients. But this guy, Kurt Sessler, came up with the RAS, the Richmond Agitation Sedation Scale. He was going to call it the Sessler's Agitation Sedation Scale, but then it would have been called Sessler's Ass. So he decided not to call it that and called it the Richmond, which was the city where he created that. I also needed psychometricians. And Ted Spearoff, here in Vietnam and here hiding behind this plant, was a very famous psychometrician, statistician. He was one of the senior support study investigators with Joanne Lynn and Frank Harrell. You know the support study, which has published well over 100 papers. He came to Vanderbilt as well. And so he formed part of the team. And then I went to the NIH to get money, and Molly Wagster became my program officer at the NIH. She was incredibly resourceful. We got the original Beeson before it was an NIH grant. Ed and I met through that work, and then got a K-23, and then, of course, that led to R01s and so on and so forth. The very first work that we did that made any difference was when we published the CAM ICU in JAMA with Sharon as the senior person on this paper, and we validated the study in triple-digit patients that had never been done before. We then followed that up with the RAS, which was the monitoring sedation status over time in ICU patients using this Richmond Agitation Sedation Scale. And with those two tools, we were able to go forward in evaluating patients like this. We would find people on ventilators, they were intubated, they were nonverbal. We needed a way to do that and measure delirium without talking to them. Every delirium paper prior to this time had this recurring sentence in it, which was incredibly annoying. And it said, mechanically ventilated patients were excluded. I remember going to the library back in the late 90s, paper journals, and pulling all these journals all over the table, and they all said mechanically ventilated patients were excluded, because I wasn't trying to invent a way to measure delirium in critically ill patients. I just wanted to get the tool off the shelf and use it, but there was nothing there. And so it was like patients like this, and we would say to them, look, hold up this many fingers. And sometimes they would do that and hold up that many fingers. He was CAM negative, of course, not delirious. And other people were coming, a Canadian group was coming up with one other mechanism by which to measure delirium, which was called the delirium screening checklist. Joanna Skrobic did this. She's a very good friend of mine. And she and I inadvertently, without knowing that we were doing this work, ended up at the Society of Critical Care Medicine at the same month, same year, presenting the CAM ICU and the delirium screening checklist. Incredible timing. I mean, she was doing this in Canada. I was doing it down at Vanderbilt. Neither of us had any idea that that was going on. And I actually went to the meeting, presenting the CAM ICU in a different session, and was walking through the posters and saw this big group of people around Joanna. I didn't even know her. I'd never met her in my whole life. And I heard her say the word delirium. And I thought, what? Somebody's talking about delirium? Because there was nothing. At the time, in critical care journals and in critical care meetings, if you went to the index at the back and looked up the word delirium, it wasn't actually there at all. There was nothing. It was never conversed or discussed at critical care meetings. So that was the way that started. Then some statisticians came in the mix, like Frank Harrell, who's done a lot to develop R. He was now the retired chairman of biostatistics at Vanderbilt, and a woman named Ayumi Shintani, Japanese. She's now back at Osaka University. She did all the biostats on all of our original work. And then we eventually published this paper in JAMA where the statistical editor at JAMA made us change one word in this title. The data, she said, were so robust that we should change the word associated to predicted. So JAMA suggested, they said, you have actually shown that delirium is a predictor of mortality, not mere association. So let's fix the title. And I thought that was a big compliment, and it was a great suggestion by the JAMA editor to do that. So I wanted to point that one word out. Now, when this is all happening, you have to think, how can we market this, not to make money, but to make people pay attention? And this is Malcolm Gladwell with my twins, two of my daughters. Brooke and Blair are there with Gladwell, and I had told them for years about the tipping point and about things that are required to make something tip. You have to have a connector, you have to have a sticky message, you have to have mavens and salespeople. These are the 4 ingredients to making something tip. So when you're trucking along in life and you've got nothing going on in the literature at all in this area, how do you make something tip up through the early 2007s? And then look at that little dashed line, which is when the CAM ICU and the DSC came out. It's the same length as on this slide. And notice how much this took off. It's an if you build it, they will come thing. So once we built it, they started coming. And people started doing research. But you had to have a tool to do the research. So after 2001, when the tools were there, people started doing this research. And now there's well over about 500, 600, 700 articles per year. I think at last count it was about 800 articles per year as we've moved forward. At the same time, in another city, J.P. Kress and Jesse Hall were doing work in Chicago, at the University of Chicago. And they were, while we were investigating delirium and stopping the ventilator, they were investigating stopping sedation. And they did the original work on what's now known as an SAT, a spontaneous awakening trial. They didn't call it a spontaneous awakening trial, they called it a sedation vacation. But imagine if, of all the things that are predisposing the critically ill patient to delirium, some of them the patient brings in with them, like age, pre-existing cognitive impairment, etc. But some of the things happen iatrogenically by us to the patient. And the most egregious one that is modifiable is sedation, truckloads of sedation overexposure. The second one is immobilization. So those are the two most modifiable pieces of the delirium world that we've learned over the years is unsedate the patient, wake them up, and get them out of the bed. Well, J.P. Kress and Jesse Hall were the ones that figured both of these things out. And we were doing all this work together. They've been co-investigators with us. We also needed psychologists to evaluate the patients afterwards. Mona Hopkins is at Utah. She became the first investigator to ever do neuropsychological evaluations of ARDS patients, published in 1998, the first paper in the Blue Journal, and then several years later, 2001, I believe, her 5-year outcomes paper. And Jim Jackson came along as a psychology intern in our group and has turned out to become, these are the two most famous psychologists in the world for critical care research. Jim Jackson is still in our SIBS Center, and Mona is a long-standing colleague. Around that time, the current dean of Vanderbilt, who was then an anesthesiologist named Jeff Balzer, sent me a young green behind the gills investigator whose name is Pratik Pandarapandi. Pratik is now the co-director of the SIBS Center with me. They wanted me to be the director of the SIBS Center, and I said, I'm not going to do it unless Pratik co-directs it with me, because he has all sorts of talents that I don't have, and he's just extremely well-liked, and he's super smart. So anyway, Pratik came in my office, sat there in the chair, and said, I want to do research. I said, what do you know about it? He said, nothing. I said, what have you done in the past? Nothing. He had come from a residency in New Jersey, purely clinical, had no advanced degrees of an MD, no statistical training. And I always say, you got to have two toolboxes. You got to have your primary PhD or MD, and you got to go get some other toolbox that specializes in research. In my case, it's an MPH. In any case, it's an MSCI, or could be an MD PhD, which some people in this room have. Anyway, he and I had an idea at the time that I had not put into play research-wise. And the idea was we should investigate something other than a GABAergic drug in the ICU for sedation. Everybody was universally using benzodiazepines or propofol at the time. Every patient in the ICU basically was on one of those two classes of drugs, propofol or benzodiazepines. I mean, I'm not kidding, universally, right? And so I thought, why are we doing only the same kind of sedation for everybody, hitting the GABA receptor? Maybe we should use something totally different. And there was this drug that was an alpha-2 agonist, and clonidine is one, this other one called dexmedetomidine. And so I said, Pratik, I want to do a randomized control trial of this. We designed the first ever randomized control trial up against a GABAergic with alpha-2 agonist in the critically ill patients, and it got published in JAMA years later. So that's how that got started. Now, so what do these two jokers have to do with the story? Because Cliff and Normie were talking at the bar one day. And what they said, Cliff, who's a mailman and a philosopher, said to Normie, well, you see, Norm, it's like this. A herd of buffalo can only move as fast as the slowest buffalo. And when the herd is hunted, it is the slowest and weakest ones at the back that are killed first. This natural selection is good for the herd as a whole because the general speed and the health of the whole group keeps improving by the regular killing of weakest members. In much the same way, Normie, the human brain can only operate as fast as the slowest brain cells. Now, as we know, excessive intake of GABAergics kills the brain. Alcohol is a GABAergic. But naturally attacks the slowest and weakest cells first. In this way, regular consumption of GABAergics eliminates the weaker cells, making the brain faster and more efficient. And that, Normie, is why you always feel smarter after a few beers. So I love this quote because it reminds me that we might be doing something deleterious to the brain. And even though he's talking about thinking faster, we know that the human being doesn't think faster after the ICU. They think much slower. But it took a while for us to prove that. There were articles at this time like this in journals. Diffuse anxiety, infuse Versed, for the continuous calm in critical care. And we actually believed that this was the right thing to do. that we had a continuous calm in the ICU. And so what we had to remember was, what we have to think of now is a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right. Thomas Paine. And what I started to feel very important about our research path was we have to investigate if what we are doing is right or wrong. And that's what led us to start investigating these two classes of drugs up against one another. And now we know, after many, many thousands of patients being enrolled in multiple different clinical trials, that the GABAergics are deleterious to the brain. They are causing much longer times on mechanical ventilation, less ability of the patient to follow directions, involve themselves with nurses and loved ones. And what we don't know is whether or not they lead to an absolute, we haven't proven yet when they lead to absolute onset of dementia or long-term cognitive impairment, but we're working on that sort of thing. In fact, we have only 22 patients left on a phase 3 investigation of dexmedetomidine versus propofol in septic patients, which we call MINS 2. This was MINS 1, and now we're doing MINS 2. Tim Gerard came along. He was another mentee of mine who's now a colleague and a SIB Center investigator. He's at Pittsburgh now, UPMC. And he helped us to have some of the first pilot data on delirium related to long-term cognitive impairment in the ICU. Tim also was the first author on the ABC study, which was the first ever randomized controlled trial to show a survival advantage to stopping sedation. That had been originally worked on by J.P. Kress and Jesse Hall, but did that microphone just go out? But then we proved that reduction of exposure to benzos and other sedatives actually improved survival, and that was Tim Gerard who helped us do that. Have you read Cutting for Stone? Anybody? Okay. It's an incredibly important and great novel written by Abraham Verghese. At one point he writes, "I came awake on the 5th day. My memory is that of floating up from the ocean bottom, my eyes still waterlogged and with what felt like scuba gear stuffed in my mouth and throat. I couldn't speak. As I broke to the surface, I understood that I was still in the ICU. I heard nothing of what anybody said." So I've always used this analogy. Here's water. Well, let me put the water level here. Here's water. I'm conscious. I'm looking around. You can see me. I'm awake. If I go below the surface of the water and the water's opaque, you can't see me anymore. Imagine a lake where I'm below the surface. You can't see me. That's sedation. Problem with sedation is when I'm unconscious, you don't know if I'm 1 foot below the water, 10 feet, or 50 feet below the water. And as he writes here, I came floating up slowly to the surface. When we turn the drugs off, they slowly rise to the surface. There's injury there. And we've actually shown, it's not in the talk, we've actually shown that burst suppression on an EEG is an independent predictor of death. And the burst suppression comes from iatrogenic sedation delivery. So I called Verghese and we wrote to one another. He talks a lot in there about some things. I'm Catholic, and he talks a lot about this nun, this famous saint called St. Teresa of Avila. And so he and I exchanged some books of St. Teresa over the years. But I told him I was using this quote, and he thought that was neat because he didn't see that coming when he wrote the novel. This is the ABC study. We shaved 4 days off the ICU length of stay, hospital length of stay, and a survival advantage. But all of this led to some other stuff that I told you we needed to make the message sticky. And sometimes people who contribute to these research stories aren't known entities. At the American Delirium Association some years ago, I was asked by a nurse, "Doctor, what do you do when somebody's delirious in the ICU?" And I said, "Well, I go through a mnemonic, whatever." And she said, "Shut up." I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Shut up." She said, "I don't want to know. I don't know who this person is. I don't know her name. But I'm about to show you something that she came up with. It's this, the Dr. Dre." I said, I use this mnemonic. And she goes, no. If I say, I'm the nurse, and I say, "Dr. Ely, Miss Smith is delirious," what happens in your brain? I said, "Okay, I think diseases, drug removal, environment." And she said, without batting an eye, "Oh, the Dr. Dre." So quickly, so beautifully, so amazing. And I thought, the Dr. Dre, that's amazing. Diseases, drug removal, environment. So I wrote to him. I asked permission. He never wrote back, but I'm taking that as a yes. Okay? We've used the Dr. Dre ever since. In our ICU, when our patients are delirious, the nurses say routinely, the patient's cam positive, I ran the Dr. Dre, and here's our problems. So we use this all the time. Sticky message, Malcolm Gladwell. How do you get things to stick? How do you get people to use things, right? So this is what we do. Am I running out of time? I probably ran out. No, we're okay. So I'm trying to give you history and tips. T.S. Eliot, we shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. How so? Back in the 60s and 70s, we walked patients on the ventilator. This is important history. This woman is intubated and the nurse is walking her around. Years later, we put people to complete immobilization and paralysis in the ICU until we started disproving this. This is a very famous, the iconic picture of ICU mobilization in the new century. This is from Dale Needham at Johns Hopkins. And what created in the interim the left turn in medicine was the advent of advances in mechanical ventilation that we thought were good for the patient. Do you remember what I told you about Pentopodon at the very beginning? What did his 3-part ARDS paper do? It focused completely where? Clavicle to diaphragm, not looking anywhere else. With that same mindset, through the 70s and 80s, doctors and inventors came up with new ways to ventilate patients. And they did it in ways that involved inverse ratio ventilation, so that we would make people inhale longer than they would exhale. Right now, you're inhaling and exhaling at about a 1-to-3, 1-to-4 ratio. But when you inhale and exhale at a 2-to-1 ratio, it becomes impossible to live unless you're deeply sedated and paralyzed. Watch. See, I can't get my air out. I'm not given time. And I can't tolerate that unless you deeply sedate me and paralyze me. And that means I'm going to be immobilized for many days on end, in which case you're going to walk into the ICU and all the patients are going to appear dead, except for the monitors that tell you otherwise. And that's what we did to patients and humans in the 90s and the early 2000s. We began to accumulate data about how this increased human suffering. And the symptoms of pain, anxiety, and delirium, pain, agitation, delirium, were the ones that we were increasing and not monitoring appropriately. So we began to come up with different ways to monitor for these with validated and reliable tools. I didn't work on the P part, but I worked a lot on the A with the RAS and the D with the CAM ICU. And we began to package this into a bundle called the A2F bundle. The A2F bundle, it was here only the A2E bundle, is now the most widely used safety bundle in critical care units around the world. It's translated in 25 languages, and we have data coming out on the same exact day, on October 22nd, that the antipsychotic paper is going to come out. We're going to publish a paper in a different journal of 15,000 patients at 70 hospitals incorporating the A2F bundle. And what we have learned there, I'll just tell you the take home, is that if you put in a graph a dose response and look at percent compliance on the y-axis, so going from 0 to 100% compliance, and on the x-axis, look at things like mortality, length of stay in the hospital, ICU, etc. What you see is as you go up in compliance, you see a reduction in mortality, you see a earlier time to hospital discharge, to time to ICU and hospital discharge, you see less bounce back into the hospital and ICU, you see less nursing home transfers, and so more successful home transfers because of something that was done in the ICU regarding the safety bundle. So I won't go into that in more depth right now, but this was the result of about 400 investigations in the peer-reviewed literature, about 40 of which were in the Lancet, JAMA, or New England Journal, and it's the history of the reformation, if you will, of critical care. And all of this was, I think, enhanced by the world of delirium research, because delirium was the centerpiece of these advances. Now, to bring it home, there's this famous movie about Robert McNamara. It's called The Fog of War. Has anybody seen this movie? Fascinating documentary about Vietnam and all the crap that happened over there. It's a terrible story. But in the movie, McNamara is approached by the engineers, and they say there are people dying in our cars. Oh, I'll deviate. People were dying in Ford trucks at this time. He was the CEO of Ford at the time. I'm going to tell you a joke. People were dying in the trucks. They said to them later on, how can we figure out what's happening and reduce these deaths? And they decided to put a black box in all of the trucks. And they could hear what people were saying just prior to the time of death. In 48 states, it was oh crap. But in my 2 states, Tennessee and Louisiana, you got a hiccup here, it was, hey Bubba, hold my beer and watch this. So we in the Deep South carry a heavy load of an accent. I try to get rid of it, but I grew up riding them alligators to school, you know, dead man. And we have a lot of problems in our poorer states in the United States. Anyway, back to truth. The engineers approached McNamara. This actually happened, not a joke. And they said, people are dying in these cars. We need something to package them better. And he said, what do you mean? He goes, well, they said, well, take eggs. When you buy eggs, you put them in a carton and you get home safely with the eggs. McNamara said, it was like the Cleavers. He goes, I don't buy eggs. I don't do my shopping. My wife does it. So I don't know anything about eggs. I said, well, take our word for it. Eggs do better in the carton. And we want to invent a safety belt for the human like the carton is a safety belt for the egg. And so they invented safety belts. And people who wore them had their lives saved. And what I think the A to F bundle is a safety belt for critically ill people in the ICU. It's a way to package the egg more safely so that you can get it home, truly home, without the injury. But right now, not enough people are using the safety belt, and we're doing work to try and increase A to F bundle exposure. This is a picture of the most famous sushi chef in the world. Do you know him? Jiro. J-I-R-O. Watch this documentary. You've seen it, Kristen. Jiro Dreams of Sushi. I was invited to go to Japan after I'd watched this movie with my daughters, and I said to the people, I will go if you take me to Jiro. And I was not kidding. And they said, well, we can't get you a reservation. I said, well, get me a reservation and I'll come there. And they did, and I did, and I went. It was myself and one other person in this restaurant. It's in a subway. You go down an escalator into a subway, and that's his restaurant. It's the strangest thing. It's the greatest sushi chef in the whole world is down there in the subway. And you have 20 pieces of sushi. And when he put down the first piece of sushi, I've got a point here, I reached up with my left hand. And I reached up for the sushi, and he started spinning like this. And I was like, whoa, what happened? And his son, who was on his side, remember the son in the movie? Son said, Dr. Ely, you're left-handed. He didn't know that. He apologizes. And every other piece of sushi after that was angulated perfectly to my left hand, where the first piece had been angulated to my right hand. A few minutes later, on my 7th piece of sushi, I waited too long. He had basted something on the piece of sushi, and I thought to myself, oh my God, this is so good. I've got to slow down. I just don't want this experience to end. And so I deliberately started pacing the situation. Jiro started spinning. I said, what did I do this time? He goes, no. If you don't eat that piece of sushi right now, it's going to be 2 degrees off the perfect temperature of that piece of sushi. I thought, oh my gosh, if he cares that much about sushi, how can I not do a better job with my research, with teaching it to others, with making things better for these human beings? And that's why I show you this picture. By the way, it's illegal to take a picture of Jiro. He doesn't allow it. But he does allow you to take a picture of the sushi. But the iPhone is very long. So when you take the picture, to let you know I didn't break his rules, later on he asked to have pictures with me. I've got pictures of him smiling. We have pictures together, so I felt like it was okay to use this picture. I'm going to stop now. I think I'm at the end. I'll just leave you with 2 other points. 2 more slides and I'll stop. The problem of delirium, Ingela Romano said, is far from an academic one. Not only does the presence of delirium often complicate and render more difficult the treatment of a serious illness, but also it carries the serious possibility of permanent irreversible brain damage. 1959, they wrote this. With increasing life expectancy and with improved survival through the influence of surgery and antibiotics, do we know how often delirium leads to dementia? And that is the question we set out to answer. And so we established the brain ICU study, and we've proved that long-term cognitive impairment after critical illness occurs. And we showed that people have tremendously abnormal cognitive impairment months to years after their ICU stay. Ed and Sharon and others in Boston have shown a great deal of information of a transient drop, a somewhat permanent drop, but not to the same degree, from elective surgery and transient surgical procedures. But the amount of brain down from critical illness over 10 days, 20 days in an ICU, et cetera, it seems to be a lot larger. In fact, this we found is going on not just in older people, but in younger people. And you can see the 30 and 40-year-olds on the far left of your screen showing you that their cognition is well out of the normal range as well. And the last slide I'll show you is that the editor of the New England Journal said to me, Mary Beth Hamill, said, well, Wes, how do we know it's not just comorbid illness? And so we created this graph out of that because we found that as you look at comorbidity, a lot of Charleston, all the way to no comorbidities on the top, and then age, top left graph, 30 and 40-year-olds with no comorbidity, you can see that they still have this cognition. And I lied, the last slide is this one that showed that delirium is an independent predictor of this drop in cognition. And now what we want to do is set up a brain bank to get the brains out of these patients' heads. And we're going to try and do what's called Brain 2. This was Brain 1, to Brain 2, where we established this brain bank in the same ICU patients. So thank you for your time. That's the ICU delirium story as I tell it, and I'd love to take any questions or whatever you're wondering. Thank you. Time for a little questions, Donna?
I think a couple minutes.
Okay. Anything you're wondering?
Can you use the mic, please?
Oh, yeah. I will. So what sort of things are on your mind from any of that, whether it be the research, the mentoring, how I found those people, how lucky it was, anything like that, just anything at all that's on your mind? Don't be bashful. Don't be shy. Go ahead.
How did you find those people?
Sharon had published the CAM in 1990. I knew of the paper, so I just started calling Yale. I found Joe Francis through Sharon, as I told you in the story. Paula Trepaz is another person whose picture could have been in the story. Paula Trepaz, the second queen of delirium behind Sharon. And Paula has left academics and is now in industry, but I went to Lilly. Paula was at Eli Lilly at the time. And I went to Lilly to find her in the neuroscience division. We actually, the first randomized controlled trial of antipsychotics was going to be with olanzapine, because Paula was at Lilly and olanzapine was a Lilly drug, and we thought that would be a great way to do it. But we ended up using ziprasidone and Haldol instead of olanzapine because ziprasidone was the only drug that had a clear liquid formulation that we could put in an IV, and the only drug with IV human data. And we didn't have that, and risperidone didn't have that, so we got rid of those other drugs basically for a practical reason. We wanted to have a double-blind IV investigation. So things like that influenced your research decisions as well. What else you wondering?
How do you decide when someone comes with an idea, how do you adjust that idea?
Right. The first thing that I do to any research idea is I apply my two, and the SIB Center people just call it Wes's two rules. So Wes's two rules are, and I've never done a study that didn't meet both of these rules. Study what you have a lot of. Either answer matters. It's super simple. If I have the best idea in the world that'll make a huge difference, but I don't have patients that can populate the study, I don't have a lot of it, I can't do the study. Somebody else can, I can't. If I have a ton of patients with a problem, but it's only interesting in one direction. If it turns out the other way, it's an academic killer. I'm not going to do the study. So I only do research that either answer matters, and I have enough to populate the study. Study what you have a lot of, either answer matters. You can meet both of those rules. You can keep asking the question of whether or not you should do the study. But if either one is not met, stop. Next question.
How do you transition from, like, as you said, when you moved to Vanderbilt, you needed to kind of think of a new research program, but also advice, like, if your research is in one area of delirium, but you want to kind of transition to a different subsection of it, how do you do that with all of your data that you already have and preliminary data and everything is in this other subsection?
Are you looking Did you move, or are you changing ideas? Or are you still just asking generally?
So I might be moving more, changing kind of ideas, and it's hard to figure out how to get appropriate grants and things if your previous preliminary data doesn't, doesn't completely apply.
Yeah.
But your knowledge about the problem does.
Two things are happening when you ask this question. And one of them is going back to dig the break, and I'll explain, dig the break, and the other one is, so I think when you're trying to either transition to a new idea, you should first look at what is leading you to ask this new set of questions or where you're going. So digging the break means what was unexpected that I didn't think I was going to find. You said, how do I use my old data? So I would go back to the data and start looking for things questions that were raised by the data that haven't been answered yet. And I would feel like there's a link between the old data and this new question because the question derived from the data. So that's one thing. I think that oftentimes we do need to use our data and make a connection. And that's the needle and thread piece. The needle and thread piece, how do you sew together your previous work to the new one? So in your grant, you better have the ability in your pilot data section of the grant to use data without pilot data, right? So I sparingly and diligently readily and diligently use the old data in the pilot area of grant data to try and weave a story. And I'm always trying to weave a story. And so I would, the first time I ever got a K, for example, I was pulling all that later work and everything, and it was a grant about delirium. So you'd say, why? How did that fit? Well, I don't remember how I did it, but I sewed it together into a story. The listener on the grant has to feel that you are weaving a story together. So keep weaving, and I think you'll have no problem. Okay, maybe one more question? Okay, one more question.
How do you keep both a wide-angle lens and a little bit of a zoom lens, right? Because if you take kind of lots of different perspectives in your research, then sometimes it can be maybe similar to the last question, a little scattered in here or there. And I think that's something that I struggle with, being too scattered and feeling pulled in different directions, not getting.
So I think any research project needs to be zooming. Okay, the research project itself needs to. You got to dive deep. But while you're doing that research project, you've got to be able to come back and pan out, to see what's happening out here with the research, because that's what lets you weave to the next question. So the research methodology should be focused enough and deep enough that you're zooming down. Allow yourself to build in other questions. I call them modules. So you have, this is my research project. I'm going to stick on other modules that build in the next research projects. When I'm done with this one, I don't want to be done. I want to have a direct to the next one. Okay, I'm over time. Thank you so much for your attention, and we'll talk more later.
My favorite quote from you that I hope we remember this whole boot camp is that the story of research is all about interacting with humans. And I hope that's what we do today, and not just mentors and mentees, but also the older adult. So thank you for that. Fabulous. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Ann Kolanowski. Ann and I have known each other forever, for a very long time. And at least forever for my research career. And Ann is one of the world's experts, really, on non-pharmacological interventions for dementia. We are very lucky because Ann has applied some of the work that she has done for many, many years in non-pharmacological or non-drug interventions for dementia. And she's also done several trials in delirium in persons with dementia. And a very important paper where she showed, and this goes back to one of the slides I think that Wes had up about executive functioning, that she was able to improve executive functioning with her trial of individualized activity, cognitive stimulation activities with persons with delirium and dementia. So fabulous work. She's been funded by the NIH, the NINR, Alzheimer's Association, Hartford Foundation, Commonwealth, National Neuroscience. She is currently a principal investigator for a 5-year NIH-funded project implementation of EIT for BPSD in nursing homes. I think one of the very important implementation project, an area that we're realizing is critically important as we do all this science to think about how do we get it out to the people who need it the most. And it's testing the effectiveness of a strategy for helping staff integrate person-centered approaches for behavioral symptoms in long-term care. She's published over 140 papers. She's a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing, GSA. She's founding director of our Penn State Center of Geriatric Nursing Excellence, someone that I have, talking about all teach, all learn, that I've learned a lot from. And I thank her very much for volunteering her time to be here today to talk with you.
Okay, well, thank you, Donna. And good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that's non-pharmacological delirium interventions, getting ready for pragmatic trials. So what I'm going to try and do in the next 35 minutes or so are a couple things. I want to talk about non-pharmacological interventions for delirium prevention and resolution, and I'm going to make this case using delirium superimposed on dementia, because that's the work I do. I want to try and convince you about the need for pragmatic trials of delirium intervention. Wes was telling us to kind of pan out, and I'm going to do something very similar. A lot of you have beginning programs of research. You're just starting to develop interventions, or you're looking at mechanisms, and I'd like you to take the long view here. Eventually, we want to impact practice. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm then going to introduce you to the Readiness Assessment for Pragmatic Trials, the RAP model. And two of you have been very gracious in letting us take a look at your beginning ideas and use the RAP model in assessing how ready that is for a pragmatic trial. So I'm going to have two people come up here and join me in about 15 minutes. So thank you for that. Well, if you go to the literature, I think you get the consistent message that delirium in older adults is common, it's deadly, and it's costly. And as we heard in the first presentation here, survivors of delirium often have long-term functional impairments. So we really need to do something about this. I mean, we really need to start thinking about interventions for delirium. A lot of practitioners continue to use antipsychotics or sedatives, but we know that there's not a whole lot of evidence for their effect. On the other hand, when we look at systematic reviews, there is evidence there that multi-component non-pharmacological interventions do have an effect for preventing delirium, things like early ambulation, keeping people's hearing aids on and working, cognitive stimulation. We also know that there is a lag from discovery to practice. We really need to start thinking about moving research into practice. You know, there's a quote that I often use in my presentations. It takes 17 years for 14% of our research to impact practice. We got to do better. And Green's quote here, I think, is very apropos of what I'm trying to convince you to do today. If we want more evidence-based practice, then we need more practice-based evidence. How many of you are familiar with this PRACES 2 model? Have any of you seen this before? Okay, this is a framework that allows investigators to take a look at the research design and to assess how explanatory it is versus how pragmatic. So an explanatory trial is one that's done under very controlled conditions. It's the gold standard randomized clinical trial, whereas a pragmatic trial is one that has less control. It's done under conditions of usual care. And in reality, most clinical trials fall somewhere along that continuum. It's not an either-or situation. We have a lot of newer clinical designs that are known as hybrid designs that combine elements of an explanatory trial with elements of a more pragmatic trial. And that's all in an effort to move what we find in our research into practice. This particular framework has 9 domains, and so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. If you want more information on this particular framework, I suggest that you visit Russell Glasgow's website that's listed on the bottom of that slide. It looks at things like eligibility criteria. Do you have a lot of inclusion, exclusion criteria? That would make it more explanatory. Or are you taking, everybody that's there in usual care? Organization. Do you need a lot of training to implement what your intervention? Or can most of the staff that are usually in the practice setting that you're interested in, can they, be easily taught to do this? Here's another, I think, excellent resource, the NIH Collaboratory Living Textbook of Pragmatic Trials, and that's the website. And again, I encourage you to think about this. So, there are, several ongoing pragmatic trials of multi-component non-pharmacological interventions for delirium. And there have been in the past, but not consistently have these trials used implementation frameworks, or at least they haven't reported it in the paper. And so I want you to start thinking again that we need to pay more attention to this. Think about eventually you want to get your intervention out there to affect practice. So, to give you a little more context, investigators have really gotten a shove, particularly those of us that are in dementia research. About a year ago, there was the first National Research Summit on Dementia Care that was held down at NIH. Its report came out in April of this year. And to give you some context, this National Research Summit grew out of similar summits that have been held at NIH that focused on the biomedical research around Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. But it was really thinking on the part of Laura Gitlin and Katie Maslow, two psychosocial researchers who said, if we want to impact the clinical area here, our care, improve, outcomes for our patients, we really need to have a summit where we come together, we identify what we already know, what we need to know in order to move our care, our research interventions, scale them up for comprehensive care services and supports for people with dementia. And so they came up with 12 themes and a number of recommendations under each of those themes. Theme number 8 has to do with scaling up and disseminating existing evidence, drawing upon implementation science. And the first recommendation under that theme was to convince investigators that you need to begin planning for dissemination early in your research process. And so taking that one step further, there's been quite a bit of post-summit activity around this theme, number 8 recommendation. Brown University School of Public Health and the Hebrew Senior Life Institute of Aging held a workshop at NIA, and that was like in December of last year. And the whole purpose of this workshop was to review the state of the science for pragmatic clinical trials for non-pharmacological interventions for people with dementia. What they did here at this workshop and in the work that's continued thereafter is establish criteria for determining when interventions are ready for launch as pragmatic trials. And they also identified the infrastructure we're going to need for conducting these types of trials. So what they came up with is this Readiness Assessment for Pragmatic Trials model, or RAPT for short. And you are the first people in the public arena that's going to be exposed to this model, because right now it's under review. And I've been given permission to share this with you with the caveat that you won't, distribute this. I do have handouts. Did we get them to everyone? Okay. So you should have three handouts here that Eva just passed around. There is a guideline for the domains of this model and scoring guidance. There's a scoring sheet for thinking about your intervention, and then there's a wheel where you actually get to graft and to map the scores that you get looking at on that wheel. Keep in mind that the Precis 2 model that I showed you is a very similar looking type of wheel, but that is assessing the research design. This particular model is actually honing in on the intervention itself. So there's 9 different domains that you think about when you're developing your intervention, as you're going along, doing your efficacy work all the way to effectiveness. And I just want to briefly go over these and then ask my 2 colleagues here to come up and tell you how they rated their particular trials. So the protocol, the implementation protocol. Is it sufficiently detailed to be replicated? And this goes hand in hand with the NIH criteria for enhancing reproducibility. So you either have no protocol, in which case you give it a 1, to the fact that you've got a very well-developed protocol for a 5. Or maybe you're somewhere in between. To what extent does the evidence base support its efficacy? Is there nothing out there? Is that where you're starting right now? Or are there several randomized clinical trials that, really support its efficacy? How about the risk? Do we know how safe the intervention is? Usually with non-pharmacological interventions, safety is, we usually don't have a lot of risk, but it's not without risk. In one clinical trial that I did where we were looking at activities for people with dementia, when we prescribed them, where we didn't take into account what their interests were, it did affect their mood. So, you need to think about risk, even though they're probably not going to be major. Feasibility. What's the extent to which this particular intervention can be implemented under existing conditions? Later in this boot camp, you're going to hear Rich Jones talk about feasibility and pilot studies. And I want you to listen very carefully to what he says, because I think his message is very important. You need to understand the context in which you are thinking about implementing your intervention. And so this might require, in addition to a good feasibility study, but also some qualitative methods that you're also going to hear later in boot camp from Dr. Marie Baltz. So that's feasibility. Measurement. To what extent can the intervention's outcomes be captured? You know, are these measures already in the electronic health record? Or are you starting from scratch? This is something, you know, that's not in there. Patient satisfaction, whatever. The cost. How likely is this intervention to be economically viable? Has anybody done any cost-benefit analyses? Again, think about that on a scale from 1 to 5. Acceptability. How willing are providers likely to be to adopt the intervention? And I think what's key here, and something that we often forget, is that on our research teams, it's really a good idea to think about who are the stakeholders. Who are the people that we're going to ask to do what we think is important for our patients, for the quality of their care? Are they going to be willing to do this? Or are you going to get, you know, the message that we often get, well, you know, I just don't have time to do that. Alignment. To what extent does the intervention align with external stakeholders' priorities? You know, is this something that you're going to get reimbursement for? You know, is it going to impact care to the point that it is important? And then finally, take a look at the impact. How useful are these intervention results going to be? Are providers, stakeholders, policymakers, do they believe that this outcome is really important? Is everyone on board? Very important, because if they're not, it's not likely that it's going to be adopted and something that will eventually change practice. So I am going to stop there and ask Drs. Holly and Karini if they would come up here. Both of these people, as I said, were very kind to take a look at their beginning interventions and use this particular model to see what they might think about. You know, we're going to assess where you're at, but start to think about, what am I going to be thinking about later on when I get to the point where this can be part of a pragmatic trial? So, Cindy, I think I'll start with you.
Okay.
What I'd like you to do is just share with people very quickly what your idea is, and then tell us how you use this and if it is helping you to think about where you'll eventually go with your idea.
Great.
Okay?
Hi, everyone. Remember, red is love. There's a lot of red up there. There's a lot of red to come in the next 3 days, I think. This idea is important to me because in addition to being a postdoc research fellow, I'm also a Red Cross Disaster Health Services volunteer nurse. And I've spent time deploying to disaster locations and caring for numerous people in a Red Cross shelter, sometimes as many as 1,500 clients in a shelter. My primary mentor in my fellowship is Jim Rudolph, who I'm sure you all know from Delirium World. He's a really amazing person to work with. But I didn't want to work on projects that he was known for. I wanted something unique. And because I'm not ordinarily a clinician, I'm looking for something that represents recognizing and preventing delirium in some unusual places, places that we might not ordinarily think of. So I thought back to my experiences as a shelter nurse. And this process of doing a mock pilot grant application has been really eye-opening. But getting to work with Anne and looking at applying this process is even more eye-opening, I think. And I wish I had it before I wrote the mock pilot, because I learned an awful lot. And Vince Moore sits one office down from me, but he doesn't know that I'm using his model yet. So we'll have a discussion when I get back. So looking at this particular diagram and the domains, in the first domain, the implementation protocol, I gave this a 1. There is no protocol. Looking at delirium in the shelter setting is not something anyone's ever done before, to the best of my knowledge, in discussion with the Red Cross. It's a little bit of a challenge to begin with, because there are no consistent medical records for people in shelters. The workforce is very transient and made up mostly of retired or semi-retired nurses, because those are the people who can deploy at the drop of a hat. And the client population is also very transient. People check into shelters, people leave shelters. It's constantly turning over. So there is no protocol. Red is love. In the second domain, evidence, I also rated that a 1. There are no efficacy studies. To the best of my knowledge, no one has studied this for the reasons I stated. When we look at risk, I chose 4. I believe that I don't foresee any risk. Volunteers would be taking a pre-test to measure their delirium knowledge, and then receiving some education, and then taking a post-test. So I don't see risk in that unless people are test averse or something along those lines. Who knows? I still have those dreams 30 years after undergraduate math that I have an exam tomorrow that I haven't studied for, so you never know what could be triggered. In terms of the feasibility domain, I found this to be pretty feasible because my volunteer colleagues are very accessible, and the Red Cross has online learning platforms already in place, so no new infrastructure needs to be created. I can also give surveys or use pre-tests on paper if I need to within my own territory. When I look at measurement, I look at pre- and post-test scores to serve as measurement. However, Ann and I had a discussion after I completed this that while I have measured on this graph the actual knowledge acquisition from pre-test to post-test, really what I'm looking at is delirium in the shelter setting. So what is the baseline level of delirium in a shelter setting, a recognition of delirium, and management of clients with delirium, to what happens after a pre-test, post-test, and educational intervention process. So it's sort of like a wheel within a wheel, I would say. So what I have looked at here for you is that smaller issue of the education piece. I think that's a little bit easier to do because that greater picture, I have no measurements. I have no before, I have no current snapshot of delirium in shelters now. Could be that the man who falls out of his cot and hits his head really doesn't have a substance use problem, he has delirium. It could be the person who doesn't get out of their cot and covers their face with a towel, does not have depression or fear or anxiety, maybe it's delirium, but we don't measure that because in our organization we don't know it. So I think I really have maybe 2 issues going on here. In terms of cost, there is little cost anticipated because, as I mentioned, the infrastructure is already in place to reach people for online education or paper-based education pre- and post-tests. So I don't anticipate a high level of cost. In terms of acceptability, because this is a mock pilot, I haven't gone into great lengths discussing it with the Red Cross, but I have found in working with other projects with them, working with them on other projects, that they're very receptive to anything that anyone is willing to do to help them improve care in our shelters or in our community disaster relief operations. I've found them to be very, very welcoming and accommodating in that regard, so I don't anticipate any real obstacles there. When I looked at alignment, I felt that this is sort of a common question for anything related to delirium. Do stakeholders get it? And sometimes those of us in what I like to call delirium world, understand that those who don't share our interests don't place a high value on delirium prevention, recognition, education, and so forth. Not that it's not valuable, but there are so many things we compete with. And so, for instance, the big initiative in the Red Cross this week is training people on how to use Narcan. So if I were to go up against Narcan, I'd lose. Delirium loses to Narcan in a shelter setting. For the most part, though, I think that there's a fairly good shot at alignment. And then impact. In terms of impact, the results are useful because we can assess any knowledge gap about delirium and address it with education for disaster health services volunteers like me. It will be, though, difficult to test in the actual setting because, as I mentioned, we don't have baseline information. We just hope that what we might be doing would help those people who could experience delirium in the shelter. So.
Okay, well, thank you. You can stay here. Actually, we did have this conversation. It's almost like you have two studies here. Does my delirium education improve the knowledge of, nurses who work in the shelters? But then take it a step further. Does that, increase in knowledge, is that enough to reduce the incidence of delirium? And it's going to be a problem if you don't even know what the incidence is of delirium. The other thing that I noticed in your application was that, and as you alluded to, delirium or even other mental health issues are not really a primary concern here in shelters. It's more the physical health of people when they come in that has to take priority. So I think using this, you see that, if this is going to be aligned with people's goals, that you really need to have stakeholders on your team early on when you're even just thinking about this intervention. You have a great way to get education out, the online platform, but it's also a very transient group, which is going to be another issue that you need to think about. You might have apparently people come, from all over the country, and their backgrounds. I'm not sure what you need in order to qualify to be a volunteer.
A license.
That's it. Okay.
A license, a little bit of online training before you deploy.
Okay.
We do have mental health volunteers who are
Okay.
counselors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and so forth, because we do see a lot of depression, anxiety, and pre-existing conditions that can become unstable in the shelter environment. So we would have, I think, some additional stakeholders from those ranks.
Okay. Did you find this helpful?
So helpful. I wish that I had read it before I started writing, because I would have written my proposal quite differently. Yeah.
Well, that's why you're here, to learn. So that's great. And I think, again, you're just starting with this idea. It's probably going to be fleshed out. You got to think about outcomes, that sort of thing. But even at that early stage, I think this is helpful. So
definitely.
Okay, well, thank you, Cindy.
Kudos for putting yourself out.
Yes.
By the way, if you want to become a Red Cross volunteer, see me outside.
Okay, Dr. Carini, if you'd like to come forward here. He has a little different type of intervention. So if you'd like to just briefly tell the group about what your idea is and then how you assessed it.
Okay. So, hello. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Anne, for letting me present the project. So, a little context. I'm a critical care physician working in Buenos Aires. This is in Argentina. It's South America. I work in a tertiary care hospital in Buenos Aires. We have 800 beds. Of those, 200 beds are for critical care. We have a 36 bed for all kind of patients. Only the cardiac patients goes to another unit. So ever since I was a resident, almost 10 years ago, I started working on delirium prevalence and prediction in the ICU. We found the work done by the group of Dr. Eli very motivating. So the project I present here has to do with that. The A2F bundle has already been proven to prevent delirium in a very effective way. We have been working on the A2F bundle implementation in our ICU. So what you see in the protocol is this guideline that we have already produced and are implementing in the ICU. Another thing that really came as a surprise to us is the proposal to do the ICU diaries. This is like a log that the patient has, similar to this. So you have this in every ICU patient. This has come from Scandinavia, from the 80s, and they have a really great story doing that. But we do not do that in the ICU. So my initial idea was to fully implement and test the hypothesis that the A2F bundle, given the many causes that delirium has, is going to be useful to prevent delirium. But I think it will have a further impact on the experiences that the family has on the ICU and on the healthcare working in the ICU. So I like to combine that with the ICU diaries, and this is the title of my project, the combination of the A2F bundle and the ICU diaries in order to prevent and improve the experiences of the families and prevent delirium, So when I had to apply the RAP model that Anne provided, I think that the implementation may require some modifications. We have already started doing this. We presented in our last national conference the results of our implementation in the ICU. We have a long way to go, but we have started. Regarding the evidence of the A2F bundle and the diaries in the ICU is overwhelming, especially regarding the A2F bundle. The diaries have not been shown to reduce delirium so far, so I guess that's a void in the literature that we may find something there. So that's a 4. Regarding the risk, there is no risk involved in this. This is a standard of care nowadays in our ICU, and it's usual care. That's why feasibility has been awarded a 3, because even though it's a standard of care, we do have some limitations regarding implementation, and especially with the ICU diaries and in our culture, it's going to be really challenging to implement this. You know, for the point, where do you put the diary, which sounds easy to resolve, but in the ICU environment it's not so easy, to who is going to write in the diary, or who is going to read the diary, or who is going to get to keep the diary after the patient leaves the ICU. Regarding measurement, this is also a 3. I think we do have to work on this. The CAM ICU is a relatively easy to use tool, but it does need some prior training. All of our residents do the CAM ICU on a regular basis. We have at least 2 measurements a day in every patient, but it will need to improve for this protocol. Regarding the cost, I look at it from a cost-benefit point of view. So even though we may have to invest some money in the diaries to start with, and in teaching and all that, I do think that we're going to impact both in the term in ICU time of stay and in the experiences of the families. So I also think that acceptability is going to be good, both by the ICU team once they understand the logic behind this combination, and for the family. We do have an open ICU, so the family can be with the patient 24/7. So that's going to be also easier to do this part. Regarding alignment, I think in the ICU environment, it has been already established that delirium is a critical point. So nowadays, when we can prove that delirium can be prevented, it usually attracts all the attention in the conference. That's our experience so far. And finally, regarding the impact, I think that if we can fully implement the combination of the A12 bundle and the ICU diaries, even though we don't prove that it can reduce dramatically delirium, which I think it will, given the multi-causality of delirium, I do think that the impact is going to be very, very big, because it's going to improve the way we connect with the families, the way we connect with all the other ICU teams, and the way we think about the patient. The A12 bundle brings to light a lot of things that otherwise just go beneath when we do rounds or we are attending the patients. So I think that's it.
Okay, well, thank you. Hang around. Very interesting. I read your application, and one thought that came into my mind has to do around the feasibility of the diary. Okay, the bundle seems to be integrated already in your practice, and people are doing it. You've got the CAM ICU that you're already using that as part of routine care. But I wonder about that diary. Like, who is going to be responsible for encouraging the person to, write in the diary? And also, I wonder about what's the outcome that you're looking for, and at what point are you going to capture that outcome?
Okay, so I cannot speak from my own experience since we have not implemented it yet. I have been to Denmark last year, and they have been using it for 30 years. So the one responsible there for the diaries is the nurse. She keeps the record, and the family of the patient can also write there. The reports from all of Scandinavia says that the patient and the family can write in the ICU diaries, and all the reviews that have been published says this. So I would guess that in our environment, in Latin America, the nurses have not been so empowered as in the States, so the nurses tend to have a secondary role, so that's going to require some training beforehand, so I guess the physician is also going to be involved. So I would say that the combination of the physician and the nurse should be in charge of the ICU diary, but the family can also write there. But that's just preliminary thoughts, I don't know.
What's the outcome what do you think it's going to?
That's also interesting. I don't think that the quantitative approach is going to be useful here. We are going to have to look at it from a qualitative standpoint, trying to find out why it works, how it works, and what exactly does it do to the patient, to the family, and to the health team. I don't think we are going to find a significant difference between groups. That's not the point. That's why I propose to do a second phase where we have interviews, in-depth interviews, with not only the quality of life measurements that we usually do, or maybe the R bands for the cognitive measures, but also an interview where you can afterwards try to understand what has the patient and the family experienced after reading the diary.
Okay, thank you. And I think, in reading your application, I got the impression that you're looking at the additive value of that diary on top of using the bundle. So yes. I think in terms of thinking about outcomes, also feasibility, and that may vary on, location where this is implemented. I'd also say, the stakeholders would be very important to have them on board right up front. Was this useful to you to think about it?
A lot.
Okay.
A lot.
Okay, I will
Thank you
let
so
them
much.
know. Okay, thank you. All right. So I encourage you to keep this in front of you as you are developing your interventions or even thinking about an intervention. I have some other resources that you might find helpful. The group from Brown does have a paper out already in JAMDA on this model, but it's not as in-depth, so I encourage you to take a look at that. And the next issue of Nursing Outlook is going to have a whole series of papers on pragmatic trials. Russell Glasgow is the author, was one of our keynote speakers, and he has a very excellent paper coming out. And I just want to acknowledge the funding I've had and also my co-presenters today. And thank you very much. Take questions. Do we have
a couple minutes for questions before break?
This is deadly before break. Yes. Yeah.
That's okay. You can
Oh.
So my question is, this is great, and it's especially great how you help people apply this and you can see it. So how much balance do you think we should do? So as people are thinking about, randomized clinical trials, it sounds like you're saying they should be thinking of these things now. So it's not, because it's really too late, if you wait. So how much balance should there be between sort of rigor and reproducibility and things that are involved?
Well, I think it's exactly what you said, and maybe what I said in the beginning. When you have a new idea, there's a trajectory, and I think you're going to have a presentation on clinical trials. And I'm assuming that individual is going to take you from pre-trial, when you're developing the idea, through, pragmatic trials, hopefully. So I think you really need to have this in front of you even in the beginning. Because, for example, Cindy, you were thinking about going into a unique setting, shelters. Well, right up front, even though you're developing something, an educational program for those nurses, you've got to think about, the impact of the setting. Are people going to be receptive to this? Because at some point where you want to implement it, you want it to work. You want it to be feasible. So I would say, it's not going to be the tight focus that you have when you're doing efficacy work. You've got to have very controlled trials, but you need to be thinking about it, because so much of the work that we've done in efficacy trials never makes it to practice. And so I think what we're hearing is that NIH is a little tired of pouring all this money into these clinical trials that really never affect practice. So I think we need to think early. Yes?
Do you think with the pragmatic trials, because often you're trying to align with the different institutions' current practice, that it's even feasible to do it in a single center? Is that kind of like an oxymoron with a pragmatic trial, where it should be multiple different institutions in order for it to be something that's generalizable?
Well, one of the domains, let me go back here, of pragmatic trials is taking a look at how flexible that intervention you can be in the delivery of that intervention. Flexibility, adherence, and that does take into consideration, what are the unique things about this particular, ICU or nursing home that impacts the delivery of this intervention.
So is it necessary to have multiple different settings in order to show that you're...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But it may not be separate institutions. It could be, if you're in surgery, it could be multiple surgeons. Right?
Surgical.
It could be multiple practices within a hospital or a neighborhood, right? So, and then there's trade-off between going huge and losing control, right? And so this basic framework, which predates the RAP model, sort of talks about along each one of these continua that they show us on this figure, the trade-off between sort of an efficacy approach and finding the treatment effect, and then your generalizability or being more pragmatic.
Any other?
Implementation science is a field unto itself. I feel like the implementation scientist is like the new statistician on many kind of trial applications and grants. Is there a move to kind of having specialists in these areas involved in the projects early on as kind of a specialist person?
Absolutely. In fact, I just reviewed a paper to that effect. Hopefully it'll be out. But yes, having people that have expertise in implementation science is a beautiful thing to have on your research team, along with having stakeholders. I talked a little bit about that. That is critical because these are the individuals that can tell you what are all the quirks here, what's going to work. You know, it'll work here, but it won't work there. And I'm constantly amazed in our current trial, which is a pragmatic trial. You know, people will give lip service to the fact that, you know, oh, this is very important. You know, we really need to do this. But when the rubber hits the road, it is amazing what takes priority. We have one nursing home now. We're going in, helping the staff to implement non-pharmacological interventions for behavioral and cognitive symptoms. And this is something that nursing homes are under the gun to do, okay? So this nursing home just had a Department of Health survey. They got slammed with a $90,000 fine. And it was one of our intervention homes. We said, listen, we'll come in and tell them what you're starting to do. They said, we don't want you in there now. We have too much to do, you know, very siloed. That's why you also have to think about the settings that you recruit for your research projects, because they're not all research ready. So.
I had a question relative to Wes's talk around non-pharmacological intervention. So Wes said a principle of what his research is the results have to be interesting no matter how it comes out. Mm-hmm. So antipsychotics in the ICU, interesting if they work, interesting if they don't work. Well,
really interesting. If they don't work, not so interesting. Right.
So should our junior faculty be even embarking on non-pharmacological interventions if they're so high risk early on in their careers?
Yeah, and I would say yes, for this reason. I think we have to start looking at the data a little differently, because for some people they work. For some people, they don't. And I think we need to figure out, you know, what are the moderators here? You know, who do they work with? That's another thing that came out of that National Research Summit. We need to do more work along getting into the weeds to find out. There may be some people where, you know, antipsychotics, you know, we've got to use them, and we never say, no, definitely don't. But two things. Staff have to have patience with non-pharmacological interventions. They need to know that, you know, if you go in there and just do something once and it doesn't work, hey, you know, you got to try again. And then figure out who is this going to be most effective? What's the profile?